the station called Threshold 9 floated at the edge of known space like a metal city hanging in the dark between stars. And it was here that Sergeant Marin Voss stepped off the transport shuttle with a duffel bag over one shoulder and a honey badger walking beside her like he owned every corridor he entered. Marin was 32 years old, lean and quiet, with short brown hair and hands that had seen more field surgery than most doctors would see in a lifetime. And she walked with the easy patience of someone who had learned long ago that the galaxy would move at its own speed no matter how much you wanted it to hurry up. Beside her trotted Sergeant Biscuit. He was 14 kilograms of muscle and attitude wrapped in thick loose skin, with small dark eyes that looked at everything like it owed him money. And he was a honey badger from Earth, bonded to Marin through the Terran Ranger Corps Death World Companion Program, which was a fancy way of saying the military had figured out that if you could not beat the most stubborn animals on the planet, you might as well make them your partners. Biscuit answered to Marin, and only Marin, and even that was more of a suggestion than a guarantee. The moment they stepped into the main concourse of Threshold 9, the scanners activated. Every public space on every Concorde station had them. Tall, slim pillars of pale light that read the biology of anyone who passed, and projected a holographic warning visible to everyone nearby. And these warnings told the aliens of the Galactic Concorde how to interact with each species they might encounter. For most beings, the scanner would glow a calm blue and read something like, "Approach freely," or at worst, a gentle amber, "Exercise caution." For Marin and Biscuit, the scanners screamed. Amber light flooded the concourse, and the holographic text pulsed in 3 languages at once. Terran human, Death World origin, do not confront. Mustelid Apex class, do not confront. The effect was immediate. A Valurian merchant 6 meters tall folded all 4 of its legs and scrambled backward into its shop, pulling a metal shutter down with a clang that echoed through the corridor. A cluster of Mechari traders scattered like startled lizards into the gaps between vendor stalls, their tails whipping behind them as they vanished. A Dulcian family walking toward the shuttle bay froze in place and then reversed direction without a word, the parent pulling its child close to its chest with 3 trembling arms. One child, though, a small Valurian with wide golden eyes, did not run, and it stood in the middle of the corridor, staring at Biscuit with the kind of fascination that only the very young or the very foolish ever showed toward a Death World predator. Its parent grabbed it by the collar and hauled it away so fast its feet left the ground. Marin sighed. She was used to this. Station, every port, every time she stepped off a shuttle, the same thing happened, and it never stopped being a little bit lonely. But she had a job to do, and loneliness was a problem for after the mission. Her assignment was simple, on paper. Ambassador Talik of the Shylin Conclave was scheduled to deliver a major address to the Galactic Concorde in 6 days, and he had received death threats from a slaver syndicate called the Crimson Wake, and the Concorde had decided he needed a bodyguard, and someone in Terran command had decided that bodyguard should be Marin. She found Talik in his quarters on the diplomatic level, a tall and impossibly thin being with 4 delicate arms and skin like pale blue parchment, and he moved with the careful grace of someone who had spent a lifetime thinking rather than fighting. And when he saw Marin standing in his doorway, he looked at her the way someone might look at a stray dog that had wandered into a library. "Terran," he said, and his voice was soft and musical, carried on air sacs that vibrated like the strings of an instrument. "Sergeant Marin Voss," she said, "Terran Ranger Corps, and this is Sergeant Biscuit." Talik looked down at the honey badger. Biscuit looked up at Talik. Biscuit yawned, and every tooth in his mouth caught the light. Talik took a careful step backward. "I was told the Concorde would send protection," Talik said, and there was a question in his voice that was not quite an insult, but was certainly close to one. "I expected perhaps a Crithian war form, or a Dulcian Psi guard. Not a single human, and a small angry animal. Biscuit is not small, Marin said. He is compact. Biscuit made a sound that might have been agreement. Talik studied her for a long moment, and Marin let him look, because she knew what he was seeing. A soft-skinned primate, with no claws, and no venom, and no natural armor, standing 5.5 feet tall, with bandaged knuckles and calm brown eyes, and she knew that everything about her looked wrong for the job of keeping someone alive. But she also knew that the Concord had sent her for a reason, and that reason was not kindness. "I will do my job, Ambassador," she said, "and you will be alive when I am done." Talik seemed to consider arguing, but then he simply nodded and stepped aside to let her enter. And Marin walked into the quarters and began doing what she always did first, which was checking every corner and every shadow and every piece of furniture for things that should not be there. It took her 11 minutes to find the device. It was small, no bigger than a grain of rice, embedded in the underside of the ambassador's writing desk, and it was a surveillance transmitter of Crimson Wake design, military grade, broadcasting on a frequency that the station's standard security sweeps would never catch. Marin held it up between her thumb and forefinger, and showed it to Talik. "Ambassador," she said quietly, "they already know you are here." Talik's forearms went very still. In the corridor outside, Biscuit sat facing the door, with his ears flat and his teeth showing, growling at something only he could smell, and the scanner above the doorway pulsed its amber warning to the empty hallway over and over like a heartbeat. "Do not confront. Do not confront. Do not confront." The lower levels of Threshold 9 smelled like engine grease and desperation, and Marin moved through them the way water moves through cracks, quiet and steady and impossible to stop. She had left her sidearm locked in the ambassador's quarters, because the lower-level scanners triggered weapons alerts, and a weapons alert in refugee territory meant panic, and panic meant people got hurt. So she went with empty hands and Biscuit at her heel, and the knowledge that she had never once in her career needed a gun more than she needed her brain. Biscuit did not like the lower levels. His neural bond flooded Marin with a constant low hum of irritation and suspicion, like a radio tuned to a station that only played complaints. And she could feel through the bond that every smell down here offended him, which was saying something, because honey badgers had been designed by evolution to eat things that smelled like death and enjoy it. The information broker was a Mekari named Rin, and Marin found him in a ventilation alcove behind a noodle stall that served food to species who did not technically have mouths. And Rin was small and gecko-like, with enormous eyes that blinked sideways, and a tail that curled around his own body like a security blanket. When he saw Biscuit, he pressed himself flat against the wall. "That is a mustelid," Rin said. "That is Sergeant Biscuit," Marin said. "It is looking at me. He looks at everything like that." This was true because Biscuit looked at everything like it was either food or a problem, and Rin appeared to qualify as both. Marin held up a small sealed container, and Rin's enormous eyes went even wider. And she could see his nostrils flare as the scent reached him even through the seal, and his tail uncurled from his body and began to twitch. "Terran coffee," Rin whispered. "Arabica blend." 200 grams, Marin said. "Yours if you tell me what the Crimson Wake wants with." "Ambassador Talik." Rin made a sound like a kettle trying not to boil. And then he talked. He talked for 20 minutes, and what he told her changed everything. The Crimson Wake was not just trying to kill Talik because he was inconvenient, and they were not trying to silence a critic or remove a political opponent, because Talik had evidence, real evidence, the kind that could not be denied or buried or explained away. And that evidence proved that the Crimson Wake had infiltrated 3 Concord member governments, and had been running slave routes through protected space for decades, with the full knowledge and cooperation of officials who were supposed to be guardians of galactic law. If Talik presented that evidence to the full Concord, the Wake would be finished. So the Wake had sent an assassin, and not just any assassin. A Vrethkai blade dancer, Rin said, and his voice dropped so low that Marin had to lean in to hear him. 4 arms and 4 monomolecular blades and a combat algorithm processor implanted in its brainstem that calculates 10,000 strike patterns per second. Marin absorbed this. When did it arrive? She asked. 2 cycles ago, Rin said. It is already on the station. Marin nodded slowly and tucked the coffee into Rin's trembling hands and turned to leave, and Rin called after her. Terran, he said, the scanner warnings are not exaggeration. The blade dancer is real. You cannot fight it with bare hands and a fat weasel. He is not fat, Marin said without turning around. He is dense. Biscuit made a sound that suggested he had opinions about being called a weasel, but was willing to let it go this once. When Marin returned to the diplomatic level, she found Talik standing at the viewport in his quarters, all 4 arms clasped behind his back, watching cargo ships drift through the dark outside the station. And he turned when she entered and studied her there. He studied everything, with the careful attention of someone who had spent his entire life trying to understand the universe, one piece at a time. Sergeant Voss, he said, may I ask you a question? You just did, Marin said, but go ahead and ask another. Talik paused, as if deciding whether that was humor, and then continued. Your species is soft-skinned, he said. You have no claws, and no venom, and no natural armor, and your bones break under pressures that a Crithian would not even notice. And yet every scanner on this station classifies you at the highest threat level, and every species that sees you either runs or reaches for a weapon. He turned all 4 of his hands palm up in a gesture that Marin had learned meant genuine confusion among the Sheolan. How, he asked, how did your world produce this? Marin leaned against the doorframe and thought about it, really thought about it, because it was a fair question, and Talik deserved it. Real answer. We are persistence predators, she said. Back on Earth, before we had tools or fire or language, we hunted by chasing things until they fell down. Not because we were fast, because we were not, and not because we were strong, because we were not, but because we could keep going after everything else had stopped. She held up one hand and looked at the scars and the calluses and the short, blunt fingers that held no claws. We do not have armor, so we learned to take hits and keep standing. And we do not have venom, so we learned to build things that were worse than venom. And we do not have claws, so we picked up rocks, and then sharpened the rocks, and then sharpened metal, and then split the atom. She looked at Talik. We are not the scariest thing on our own planet, Ambassador. We just refuse to lose to the things that were. Talik was quiet for a long time. In the corridor outside the quarters, Korvan, the station security chief, stood, with a datapad in his insectoid hands, reading Marin's service record for the 3rd time, and his compound eyes moved across the text with increasing unease. 3 Death World deployments, and a kill count listed as redacted, and a psychological evaluation that said, Sergeant Voss demonstrates an atypical calm response to lethal threat stimuli, and recommends continued service. And Korvan read that line again and again, because in his experience, calm was not the word you used for soldiers who had seen what this woman had seen, unless something about them was fundamentally different from everyone else. He doubled the guards on the diplomatic level, not to protect Talik from the Crimson Wake, but because he was not entirely sure what would happen if someone cornered the human. That night, Marin sat on the floor of her assigned quarters, cleaning her boots, while Biscuit slept in a ball on the bed he had claimed as his own. And her communicator chirped, and Rin's voice came through shaking with fear. Terran, he said, the blade dancer. It has moved to the upper levels. The kill is scheduled for next cycle, during the reception. Marin looked at Biscuit. Biscuit opened one eye. Through the neural bond she felt his response, simple and clear, and utterly without hesitation. Good. Let it come. The ambassadorial atrium of Threshold 9 was a vast domed chamber with walls of living crystal that shifted color with the mood of the crowd. And tonight it glowed in shades of gold and violet, because 30 species had gathered for the pre-address reception, and the mood was one of cautious celebration. The kind of happiness that comes from believing that things might actually get better. Marin stood 3 steps behind Ambassador Talik, wearing her dress uniform, which was the same as her field uniform, but cleaner. And she watched the room the way a hawk watches a field, not looking for anything specific, but ready for everything. Biscuit sat at her feet, with his ears turning like satellite dishes, sampling the air with every breath, cataloging the scent of every being in the chamber, and filing them into 2 categories that were the only categories Biscuit had ever needed. Not a threat. Threat. The reception moved like all diplomatic events moved, slowly, with too much talking, and Talik drifted from group to group with his 4 arms, gesturing gracefully as he spoke. And Marin drifted with him like a shadow that happened to have combat training. And for 2 hours, nothing happened, except that a Valurian diplomat spilled a drink on a Dulcian trade minister, and caused a minor incident that Marin did not care about, even slightly. Then Biscuit went rigid. Every muscle in his 14-kilogram body locked at once, and through the neural bond, Marin felt it hit her like ice water poured directly into her brain. Wrong. Threat. Kill. Marin did not hesitate, because hesitation was a luxury that belonged to species who had not evolved on a world where everything was trying to eat them. And she stepped forward and put her hand on Talik's shoulder and pulled him behind her in one smooth motion. Contact, she said. The word was quiet, but it carried, and Corvan, who was monitoring from the security station, heard it in his earpiece, and his compound eyes went wide. In the center of the atrium the air shimmered. The shimmer cloak fell away, like water sliding off glass. And the Vrethkai blade dancer stood revealed. And he was terrible. Kethvaran was 2 meters tall, with 4 arms that ended in hands that were not hands, but weapon mounts. And from each mount extended a monomolecular blade that was so thin it was nearly invisible. Just a faint line in the air, like a crack in reality. And his body was armored in plates of dark chitin, and his eyes were black and calculated and utterly empty of anything that could be called mercy. The crowd saw him, and the crowd screamed. Every scanner in the atrium fired at once, and the warnings stacked on top of each other, in layers of amber and red light. Vrethkai Blade Dancer, threat level extreme, do not confront. Terran human, do not confront. Terran fauna, do not confront. 3 do not confront warnings in 1. Room and the diplomatic corps shattered like glass, aliens running in every direction, trampling each other to reach the exits. And in the chaos, Kethvaran moved. He was fast. He was so fast that Marin's eyes could barely track him, and the combat processor in his brainstem was calculating strike patterns faster than any organic brain could match. And his first attack was aimed at Talik, a lateral slash from the lower right arm, designed to cut the ambassador in half at the waist. Marin did not dodge, because dodging would have left Talik exposed. She did not reach for a weapon, because she did not have one. She reached out with both hands, and she caught the blade. The technique was called a cross clamp, and it was taught in exactly 1 military program in the entire galaxy, because only 1 species was insane enough to try it. And it worked like this. You brought both palms together on the flat of the blade, and you squeezed with everything you had, and you did not let go no matter what happened to your hands. The monomolecular edge bit into her fingers and her palms, and blood sprayed in a bright red arc across the white marble floor. And the pain was extraordinary, the kind of pain that should have made her let go and fall and scream, But Marin's body did what human bodies had been doing for 200,000 years when something tried to kill them. It flooded her with adrenaline. Her pupils blew wide, and her heart rate doubled, and her grip strength, which was already remarkable by galactic standards, tripled. And her hands became vices made of bone and tendon and fury, and she held the blade, and she did not let go, and she twisted. Keth Voron felt the blade wrench sideways in his grip, and for the first time in his operational existence, his combat processor returned an error. Because no species in his database did this, no prey animal grabbed the blade. This was not in any calculation possible. And then Biscuit hit him. 14 kilograms of honey badger launched from the floor like a furry cannonball, and latched onto the blade dancer's lower left arm, with jaws that could crack a tortoise shell. And Biscuit bit down and did not let go, because letting go was not something honey badgers did. Not ever, not for any reason. And if the universe itself asked Biscuit to release, he would have bitten the universe too. Keth Voron slashed at Biscuit with his remaining blades, and the edges cut across the honey badger's hide. But honey badger's skin is thick and loose, and the blade slid across it like trying to cut a bag of sand, never finding purchase, never cutting deep enough to matter. And Biscuit thrashed and ripped and snarled, with a sound that came from somewhere ancient and primal. A sound that made every prey-evolved species still in the room go completely still, as 10 million years of survival instinct told them to freeze, and not move, and not breathe. P. Marin wrenched the captured blade free from the arm mount with a wet tearing sound, and now she had a weapon, and she closed the distance. She fought the way Terrans fight, which was not beautiful, and not elegant, and not anything that would look good in a training video, because she fought to win, and winning meant breaking things, and she targeted the nerve clusters that Rin's intelligence had identified, and she broke joints that were not designed to bend in the directions she bent them, and she used the assassin's own blade against the gaps in his chitin armor. Keth Voron's combat processor screamed warnings at him, but the warnings were useless, because all of his training data was wrong, because no species was supposed to catch a monomolecular blade bare-handed, and no species was supposed to keep fighting with hands cut to the bone, and no animal was supposed to be physically impossible to remove from his arm. 11 seconds. 11 seconds from the moment Marin caught the blade to the moment Keth Voron hit the floor unconscious. And in those 11 seconds, the scanners had kept flashing their amber warnings to a room that no longer needed them, because everyone who was still present had seen with their own eyes exactly why the warnings existed. The atrium went silent. The only sounds were Biscuit's growling and the soft, steady drip of Marin's blood falling onto the white marble. She stood over the assassin, swaying slightly with blood running from her destroyed hands and soaking through her uniform sleeves. And her face was pale, but her eyes were steady, and her breathing was controlled, because she was a persistence predator, and persistence predators did not stop until the threat was finished. She looked down at Biscuit, who was still clamped onto the unconscious assassin's arm. "Biscuit," she said, "release." Biscuit did not release. Biscuit considered this for a moment, and then reluctantly opened his jaws and stepped back, chittering with deep and obvious disapproval. Marin turned to Talik, who was standing exactly where she had pushed him. All four of his arms pressed against his chest, his blue skin gone almost white, and his eyes were wide with something that was not fear, and was not gratitude, but was something much larger than both. "Ambassador," Marin said, and her voice was calm and even, and her blood was pooling on the floor beneath her. "I would recommend we relocate." Then her knees buckled. Corvon caught her before she hit the ground, because the insectoid security chief had been running toward her since the moment the first blade had fallen, and he was fast when he needed to be. And he lowered her to the floor and called for medical with a voice that cracked for the first time in his career. His report to Concord Command that night contained only one addendum, written in his own hand at the bottom of the official document. "Respectfully recommend upgrading Terran threat classification. Current rating may be insufficient." Marin woke up in the medical bay with the taste of copper in her mouth and a honey badger asleep on her chest. The ceiling above her was a soft, luminous white, and the air smelled like antiseptic and something floral that she assumed was meant to be calming for non-human patients, but mostly just made her nose itch. She tried to move her hands and discovered that they were wrapped in thick medical gel that pulsed with a faint blue light as it worked to rebuild what the monomolecular blade had taken apart. She could not feel her fingers. That was probably for the best. A Shoalin doctor stood at the foot of her bed, staring at a holographic display of Marin's biology, with an expression that on a human face would have been somewhere between amazement and horror. And beside the doctor stood a second physician, a Valorian, who was reading the same data and making small distressed sounds with each new line. Her adrenal response during the fight, the Shoalin said. Doctor said quietly, as though Marin might hear, which she could, because human hearing was another thing the galaxy consistently underestimated. Her body produced a chemical compound that suppressed pain perception by 70%, while simultaneously increasing reaction speed and muscular output by a factor of 3. The Valorian made another distressed sound. It is an endogenous compound, the Shoalin continued, meaning her body manufactured it internally and released it voluntarily in response to the threat. And the compound also increased blood clotting speed, which is why she did not bleed to death on the atrium floor, despite lacerations that severed 2 tendons and exposed bone in 4 locations. What is the compound called? The Valorian asked. They call it adrenaline. And this is unusual for their species. The Shoalin doctor looked at the Valorian with all the gravity that a being who had studied xenobiology for 2 centuries could bring to bear. They all have it, she said. Every single one of them. It is a standard feature of Terran biology. Their bodies are equipped with a built-in chemical override that turns off pain and turns on strength when they are in danger. And they have had it for their entire evolutionary history. The Valorian sat down. That is horrifying, it said. That is not even the worst part, the Shoalin said. Look at the tissue regeneration rates. The holographic display showed a time-lapse of Marin's hand wounds, and even through the medical gel, the tissue was already knitting back together at a rate that made both doctors lean closer to the display, because the cells were multiplying, and the collagen was reforming, and the tendons were reattaching themselves with a speed and determination that seemed almost aggressive, as though Marin's body was personally offended by the damage and intended to fix it out of spite. Said, their bodies actually repair themselves. Continuously, the Shoalin said, from birth until death, and they can recover from injuries that would be fatal to most galactic species. Broken bones, and torn muscles, and burns and lacerations, and even the loss of certain organs. And they do it without external intervention. Their biology simply refuses to stop working. The Valorian looked at Marin sleeping on the bed with a honey badger on her chest and medical gel on her hands, and blood still crusted on her uniform. What kind of world produces a species like this? It whispered. Neither doctor had an answer. Biscuit, meanwhile, had established what Marin would later describe as a defensive perimeter around her bed, which meant that he had bitten 2 orderlies who tried to move him and had growled at a cleaning drone until it changed its route. And eventually, someone had draped a medical blanket over him in what Marin suspected was less an act of kindness, and more an act of surrender. She fell back asleep with Biscuit's weight on her chest and his heartbeat against her ribs. And through the neural bond she felt his emotional state, which was a complicated mixture of satisfaction and vigilance and something warm that Biscuit would never admit to feeling, and that Marin would never embarrass him by naming. When she woke again, Talik was sitting beside her bed. He looked different. Not physically, because Shoalin did not change their appearance based on emotion the way humans did. But something behind his eyes had shifted. Some fundamental assumption about the universe had been removed and replaced with something heavier and more honest. "How are your hands?" he asked. "Still attached," Marin said. "So better than expected." Talik did not smile, because Sheolin did not smile, but his upper arms made a small gesture that Marin had learned meant quiet appreciation. "I have been thinking," he said, "about what you did." "I did my job. You caught a monomolecular blade with your bare hands. That was part of the job." Talik leaned forward, and his voice was careful and measured, the way it always was, but underneath it there was something raw. "I have studied conflict for 80 years, he said. "I have written 12 volumes on the philosophy of violence and the ethics of force, and I have interviewed warriors from 9 species and analyzed combat data from 3 centuries of galactic conflict, and I have never, not once in all of that research, encountered a species that would choose to be injured." Marin looked at him. "You did not fail to dodge," Talik continued, "and you did not make an error. You made a decision, a conscious, rational decision, to accept grievous harm to your own body in order to protect someone you had known for less than 2 days." He paused. "Why?" Marin looked at her hands, wrapped in their blue pulsing gel. And she thought about the question the way she thought about everything, practically and honestly. "Dodging would have left you exposed," she said. "I had no weapon. Pushing you might not have been fast enough. And my hands were the only tool I had." "But your hands will heal," Marin said. "That is the persistence predator thing, Ambassador. We can take damage and keep going. Most species cannot. So when the math comes down to it, we spend ourselves, because we know that our bodies will try to put themselves back together afterward. And even if they cannot, we have already decided that the mission matters more than the pain." Talik was silent for a long time. "You frightened me," he said finally. "Not during the fight. I was too shocked during the fight to feel anything. But afterward, when I understood what you had done, when I understood that you had performed a calculation in the space between heartbeats that weighed your own body against my survival, and found your body to be the lesser cost." He looked at her with eyes that were old and wise, and for the first time, uncertain. "That is not what I expected when they sent me a human bodyguard." "What did you expect?" "Someone who would stand between me and danger." "That is what I did." "No," Talik said, "you did not stand between me and danger. You grabbed danger by the blade and bled on it until it stopped moving, and your animal bit it, and I am told it took 2 security officers to remove him." Marin glanced down at Biscuit, who was awake and listening with one ear turned toward Talik. 3, she said. "It took 3, and one of them is still in medical." Talik made the Sheolin gesture for quiet appreciation again, and this time it lasted longer. In the security wing, Corvan finished his interrogation of the captured Kethvoran, and what he learned turned his ichor cold. Because the Blade Dancer was not the endgame. The Blade Dancer was a test. A probe to determine the strength of Talik's protection. And the real attack was coming. Not a single assassin, but a full assault team targeting the Concord chamber itself on the day of the presentation. Because the Crimson Wake had decided that if one blade could not silence Talik, then a dozen guns would. Corvan transmitted the intelligence to Marin immediately. She read it on the medical bay display, with Biscuit still on her chest and her hands still wrapped in healing gel. And she was quiet for exactly 4 seconds. Then she sat up and swung her legs off the bed and began checking her gear. "Sergeant Voss," Talik sent from the doorway. "The Concord has offered to assign a Crithian Warform squad for the presentation." "Good," Marin said. "They can cover the perimeter. And you." She looked at him with calm brown eyes and bandaged hands, and a honey badger climbing onto her shoulder like a parrot made of fury. "Biscuit and I will be in the field. Room." Expletive. The Grand Concord Chamber was the largest enclosed space on Threshold 9, a cathedral of crystal and light, where the fates of civilizations were debated by beings who had crossed the stars to sit in chairs that were never quite the right shape for their bodies. And on the morning of Ambassador Talik's presentation, it was full. Delegates from 37 species filled the tiered galleries, and the air hummed with translation fields that converted every word into every language simultaneously. And the chamber's living crystal walls had settled into a deep and solemn blue that meant the Concord was in formal session. Marin stood at the base of the podium, with her hands freshly unwrapped, and her fingers scarred and pink with new skin that was still tender but functional, and Biscuit sat beside her, with his eyes moving across the crowd in slow, deliberate sweeps. Talik climbed the podium steps, and his forearms arranged his notes, and his voice, when it came, was... He began to speak. He spoke about the Crimson Wake, about slave routes hidden in the margins of shipping lanes that the Concord was supposed to protect, about officials who had been bought and commanders who had been compromised. And he laid out the evidence with the precision of a philosopher who had spent his entire life learning how to make truth impossible to deny. The chamber listened. Some delegates leaned forward, and some leaned back. Some made sounds of anger, and some made sounds of fear, and the living crystal walls shifted through shades of red and amber as the mood of the room darkened with every new revelation. Marin watched the doors. She watched the ventilation shafts, and the maintenance panels, and the service corridors that fed into the chamber from below. And through the neural bond, she felt Biscuit's senses layered over her own. His nose, reading the air like a book. His ears, catching frequencies that her human hearing could not reach. 12 minutes into the presentation, the lights went out. The EMP hit the chamber like a silent thunderclap, and every automated defense system died at once. The shield projectors and the scanner arrays and the communication relays all going dark in the same instant. And the chamber was plunged into a blackness that lasted exactly 2 seconds before the emergency lighting kicked in and painted everything in dim red. The doors at the eastern entrance blew inward. 8 figures came through the breach in combat formation, armored and armed with plasma rifles and shock grenades, and they moved with the coordinated efficiency of professionals who had done this kind of work before and expected to do it again. The Crithian warforms engaged at the perimeter, massive armored beings slamming into the first wave of attackers with the force of small vehicles, and the sound of the impact shook the gallery floors and sent delegates scrambling for cover beneath their desks and behind their chairs. But 2 attackers made it through. They came through the gap in the Crithian line fast and low, one firing suppressive bursts at the galleries to keep heads down, while the other sprinted toward the podium with a weapon aimed at Talik. Marin moved. She grabbed Talik by the collar and pulled him down behind the podium's crystal base, and the plasma bolt that would have taken his head passed through the space where he had been standing and burned a black streak across the chamber wall. "Stay down," she said, and then she was gone. She used the chamber's architecture the way a river uses rocks, flowing around the tiered seating and the support columns, keeping cover between herself and the shooters, and she was not alone, because Corvan was in her earpiece, coordinating from somewhere in the chaos, and feeding her positions. 2 hostiles passed the perimeter, Corvan said, one in the eastern gallery, one approaching the podium from the south corridor. "Copy," Marin said, and she went for the closer one. The mercenary in the eastern gallery was a Drelthic heavy gunner, twice Marin's mass, and armored in plates that could stop a standard sidearm round. And when it saw her coming, it swung its plasma rifle toward her with the mechanical precision of someone who had killed many times before. Marin did not have a gun. She had a chair. She threw it. The chair was not a weapon by any reasonable definition, but it was heavy, and it hit the gunner's rifle barrel hard enough to knock the aim wide, and the plasma bolt went into the ceiling instead of into Marin, and then she was inside the gunner's reach, where the rifle was useless, and she was doing what humans did best in close quarters, which was making everything worse for everyone involved. She targeted joints and pressure points and the gaps between armor plates, and she took a plasma graze across her left shoulder that burned through her uniform and seared the skin beneath. And she did not stop, because stopping was not in the operational parameters of a Death World persistence predator. And she put the Drelthic on the floor in 9 seconds, using a combination of techniques that no single species had ever bothered to combine, because no single species had ever needed to be that desperate or that creative. The second mercenary never reached the podium. Biscuit intercepted it in the south corridor. The mercenary was a Vekari, tall and fast, with reinforced limbs designed for speed, and it looked down at the 14-kilogram animal blocking its path, and made the mistake of thinking that size determined threat. Biscuit hit low and hard, going for the ankle joint the way honey badgers had been going for structural weaknesses since before humans had learned to walk upright. And the Vekari went down with a sound of surprise and pain, and Biscuit was on top of it instantly, biting and thrashing and making the sound, the ancient terrible sound that turned every prey instinct in the corridor into a choir of screaming alarms. The Vekari dropped its weapon and tried to pry Biscuit off, and learned what every creature who had ever tried to pry a honey badger off anything had learned, which was that you could not. The tide turned completely when the maintenance tunnel access panel burst open, and 4 more Terran Rangers poured into the chamber. Ranger Okafor came through first with a gray wolf at his side, lean and silent and fast as thought, and behind him came Ranger Chen with a red-tailed hawk on her armored forearm that launched itself into the air the moment it cleared the tunnel. And behind her came Ranger Mbeki with a Komodo dragon that walked into the room with the slow, calm confidence of an animal that knew it was the most patient killer present. And last came Ranger Johansson with an octopus sealed in a mobility suit that moved on 8 mechanical legs and had already hacked the chamber's backup systems to restore partial lighting. The remaining mercenaries, who had been struggling against the Crithian warforms, now found themselves facing 4 additional humans and a collection of Earth's most improbable evolutionary achievements. And the fight went out of them like air from a punctured hull. It was over in 90 seconds. The chamber fell quiet, except for the sounds of groaning mercenaries, and Corvon barking orders, and the distant wail of station security, finally arriving too late to matter. And then something happened that Marin would remember for the rest of her life. Talik stood up. He rose from behind the podium, with dust on his robes and a burn mark on one of his lower arms, where a plasma bolt had grazed him, and he looked out over the shattered chamber, where delegates were emerging from their hiding places, and security teams were binding the fallen mercenaries, stood, bloodied and breathing hard, with their impossible animals beside them. And Talik walked back to the podium. He picked up his notes. He continued his presentation. His voice shook, and his hands trembled, and there was blood on the pages, but he did not stop. Because a human woman with scarred hands and a small furious animal had taught him something about what it meant to keep going when everything in the universe was telling you to quit. The Concord voted unanimously to dismantle the Crimson Wake. The vote was not close. 3 days later, the Galactic Concord officially upgraded Earth's membership from provisional to full member with strategic advisory status, a classification that had not existed before that morning, and had been created specifically because the existing categories did not have a box for species that catches blades bare-handed and brings a honey badger to a gunfight. Corvon submitted a formal request to establish a joint training program between his species and the Terran Ranger Corps, and his application included a personal note that read, "If the galaxy insists on producing threats like the Crimson Wake, it is prudent to have Deathworlders on our side of the line." On the last evening before Marin's transport departed, she sat in the station's observation lounge with Biscuit beside her, watching cargo ships drift past the viewport like slow silver fish swimming through an ocean of stars. Her hands were scarred but whole. Her shoulder was bandaged but healing. Biscuit was eating something he had definitely stolen from the commissary, and he was not sorry about it. A sound made her look down. The young Valurian child, the same one from the concourse on the first day, the one with the wide golden eyes who had stared while every other alien ran, stood beside her chair, looking up at her with an expression of pure and fearless curiosity. Above them, the scanner pulsed its amber warning. Terran human, do not confront. The child ignored it completely. It reached out one small, trembling hand and gently patted Biscuit on the top of his broad, flat head. Biscuit allowed it. This was unprecedented. Marin watched the child pet her battle-scarred companion, and she felt through the neural bond, something she had never felt from Biscuit before. A softness, a warmth, a tiny crack in the armor of the most stubborn animal on the most stubborn planet in the galaxy. She smiled. "See, Biscuit," she said quietly. "Not everyone reads the warning label." Biscuit chittered. It might have been contentment. It might have been a threat. With honey badgers it was always hard to tell. The scanner pulsed above them one final time, amber light washing over the human and the honey badger, and the alien child, who had decided that warnings were just words, and that sometimes the most dangerous things in the universe were also the most worth knowing. Do not confront. The child kept petting Biscuit. Biscuit kept allowing it. And somewhere in the vast indifferent dark between the stars, the galaxy turned. And the persistence predators from the little blue death world kept doing what they had always done,